Welcome to That's So Rad podcast. I'm your host, Travis Vonksness. This is a podcast about people, their passions, their life experiences, and their stories. As writer Frederick Buechner once said, the story of any one of us is in some measure the story of us all. All of us can learn something valuable from someone else's life and their stories. Join us for another conversation where we learn, laugh, and leave, seeing our own life in new ways. What's more rad than that? Welcome to That's So Rad podcast. I'm your host, Travis, and today I'm flying solo. I am excited about this episode today on the topic I'm going to talk about. Hopefully I can weave together something fairly coherent here, but I was super inspired by this story that I encountered a couple years ago in 2024, and some of you may have heard this as well. This guy basically lived 72 years of his life mostly in an iron lung. So that's already crazy enough. And if you've ever seen an iron lung, by the way, it's crazy creepy. You see them in museums and you just kind of imagine yourself laying in this tube and, coughing up your lungs or whatever it would have entailed. But I think the thing that, So really piqued the attention of this story, not only just obviously the length of the time this guy's in an iron lung. Paul Alexander is his name, but he ended up writing a memoir later in his life with the assistance of a friend, but mostly using a plastic stick and a pen to tap out on a keyboard this book about his life called 3 Minutes for a Dog, My Life in an Iron Lung. We're going to talk more about the book later, but so using a stick laying in the iron lung and then a pen attached to that where he typed on the keyboard. And it took him nearly 8 years to write this book. So when I heard also that he had a book that took him 8 years in the context of how he had to write it, you better believe every single letter of that book was fought for. And I'm like, if ever there was a book that any of us should read, it should be the book written by a guy who would use a pen in his mouth while he's laying in an iron lung. I mean, if that alone is not like one of the most inspiring, crazy things ever, I don't know what is. But so I had the book on Kindle and kind of started it and then got sidetracked. And, but anyway, I finished the book and I really want to do a podcast on this. So what we're going to do, I'm going to talk a little bit about the overview, just a little bit more of his life, and then bounce around a little bit, and then some just quotes from his actual book and kind of what this has meant to me. So I think, this is a type of story that is so sensationally crazy that it's just like, it's hard to even have words, honestly. But I do know for me, part of it is that, having a brother who had a traumatic brain injury and is largely trapped in his body since 2009, and also he cannot speak, but he can spell with limited movement moving his hand, and we can, go through each letter of the alphabet, or he also has an eye gaze device. But so much of Paul's story, I think reading the book and then just kind of some of his experience, like really reminds me of my brother and, the uphill climb he's had just to, survive and also cope with life. So there's that part of it as well. And then, as I was thinking about this podcast episode, I was driving home we have some land in Tennessee. And so regularly I'm going out to the land and, spending time out there and then coming back. And I'm always fascinated by bumper stickers that are really thought provoking. Cause we all know the bumper stickers that, whether it's telling you to not pollute or, some sort of really, kind of judgmental line, about religion where, it's just off-putting more than it is instructive. there was a line, or there was a bumper sticker on someone's car that said, "Live a great story." And man, I was like, wow, that's a cool bumper sticker. Live a great story. And I kind of was thinking of that more and more as I was driving home. And, the thought occurred to me that, we don't, um, we don't, we don't really, we're not in charge of a lot of the events in our story. A lot of us, I mean, it feels like we're placed in a story. Um, and so in a way, you know, in many ways, we don't have control of the outcomes of situations in the story, but we do control how we carry ourselves, where we walk, how we influence others, how we tell about our story and experience. And so, as I was thinking about this episode of Paul's story, I thought, wow, what an example of living a great story. Um, and and in fact, he has another quote where he says, "Life is the only thing like it. It's the only thing there is. My point is this," he says, "life is such an extraordinary thing. I hurt. I've had bites on my legs from roaches. I've had the electricity go out for a long time and I couldn't breathe. I passed out and I would always wake up. What you believe or not, God doesn't want you to die. He created you and he created me. I lay here and I think about it, and in my mind, it's just hope. Just hold on. It'll get better. Just give it a chance." Man, if you need a dose of just uh, hope and kind of inspiration, a line like that, and again, the context where this guy's coming from, it's just pretty cool. So, a little bit more about Paul. So I've got some notes. I'm just kind of bouncing around on here, but so he contracted polio in 1952 at the age of 6, and doing a little digging on polio, it actually, for the U.S., that was the deadliest year of it in 1952. Interesting thing about it, so it's a highly infectious disease caused by the polio virus. While it's largely been eradicated in many parts of the world, it still is not fully eradicated. The U.S., I think, was considered eradicated in 1994. But one thing I didn't know, just kind of reading more about polio, is that the vast majority of people who did get it, about 72 to 95%, don't even show symptoms. And, and then there's like different variations of grades or whatever of it. So for some people, it's not much of a thing. And so Paul would be in this rare and severe form, less than 1% of cases, where it destroys motor neurons, leading to temporary or permanent paralysis, usually in the legs, and then breathing muscles are affected. So giving a little bit more of the overview of just his life, and then we'll kind of go back into the story of what he battled. He went on to, so actually rewind. At age 6, he spent, I think it was 18 months straight in a hospital. And he details some of this stuff in his book, which is just incredibly wrenching, at 6 years old. So he talks about, again, this is August of 1952, that he says what this was like as a kid. So every waking moment, I was so very hot in my iron lung under the steam tent. Usually I was lying on my waist all day. And this is a kid too. And no one had the time to check on me. My skin always felt as if I was on fire, and I also itched to the point of pain, but I could not move or scratch in an attempt to relieve the torment. He has a line, "Polio gives its victims the gruesome opportunity to slowly suffocate." And then he kind of describes the scene at what would be I guess, polio ward, where they would house a lot of these kids, I think, in his place, but obviously adults as well. He talks about it was like being buried alive for days at a time in a mass grave composed of row upon row of iron lungs facing each other as far as you could see in long rooms they called wards. Um, so, so he has this experience of where like 18 months, I think it was, where he's in this ward, and a lot of people die there. A lot of the kids die, inadequate care. And so he's sort of like in this place of just complete panic at times of where, can you imagine like you're laying there in this tube and you're, seeing the hysteria and other people suffering and struggling and just wondering like, when's my time to go? And so he makes a recovery, and he details all this in the book, where he gets to go home. And so his parents bring him home. They have like a generator actually hooked up in the transport truck to keep the iron lung going. And then he gets home with it, and that's where sort of this new chapter of his life is. A little bit more learning here. So the iron lung was invented in 1928, and it uses a vacuum to create inhalation and then reverses the movement for exhaling. So it's basically like this mechanical tube that's, making your lung compress and then ease in and out while your head's outside of it. And so crazy too, learn that there was a manual crank on it if the power went out. So, imagine the power going out and you're just cranking just to keep this person alive. Unbelievable. About 1,200 patients in the US use them in the 50s. That was kind of the big heyday of, again, when polio was sort of at its peak. And then by 2004, there's only 40 users left. And then at Paul's death in 2024, there's a living lady, I think, that still uses it. So it's crazy. It's unbelievable. Thinking about this device that some of us have seen in museums, and even at the time, I mean, well before the last chapters of his life, like even in 2004, which is over 20 years ago, they were basically, non-existent except in a museum. And so, but to still be relying and using that, is crazy. So let me pick the story back up where, he talks about being at home. And one of the things I think that reminds me of my dad in relation to my brother Jeremy's care is dad was an inventive guy, a farmer, always fixing stuff, always making repairs to things, but also had an ingenuity of just like, I'm just going to figure this out. I think some of that comes from necessity of, again, from the farm, limited resources. I always say like, no one's coming for you, so if you were in a bind, I mean, it was like figured out. But also just like this kind of work ethic too. And this kind of thing. Yeah. Just, I think some of our upbringing and coming from that place in North Dakota of just, we'll do this, we'll figure this out. Anyway, as I read this Paul's story, I thought a lot about how he talks about his own dad and the role he played in giving him hope and believing in him and believing in possibility. I think that when we find stories of people who were incredibly inspiring, what we'll always also find is that there were people in their life that believed in them, that maybe at a pivotal moment gave them hope when they had lost it, or dreamed some dreams of possibility that maybe they didn't see, and helped kind of lift and support them. And then they sort of fly like a bird that leaves a nest. And I really see that, Paul describes his dad in that way. His inventiveness. I'm so reminded of my own dad. So when Paul talks about, as a kid, he had come back from the hospital, and he's now at home and with his iron lung and living at home. And he has this line from his book where he says, "When my dad pushed that 7-foot massive iron lung to the dining table every evening for supper, I became part of the family again and could heal and grow stronger with them." Incredible. Just that act of saying, no matter if you're in this tube or whatever, you are one of us. That's never changed. So profound, the profound image of that, picturing that in the kitchen. Thinking of my dad with my brother, a lot of people would have just been in over their heads or intimidated and just said, he's going to have to go to a facility. And, dad was, he's coming home. And no doubt that Jeremy, in our story, coming home and still being at home, though home has kind of evolved or changed a bit since 2009, that has been as integral to his healing and his well-being and his just his own hope. I can't think that Jeremy would maybe even be here, being in a facility this long. So definitely see that part. But what I loved is that in his dad's inventiveness, he talks about, so it was his dad that initially cut the plastic sticks for him to use with his mouth and then devised a way to attach brushes for him to paint with, pencils to draw with, and pens to write, Paul describes. He says, "Dad's creative efforts not only made my life in the iron lung more tolerable, but opened doors, allowing me to expand into the world in which I could advance my abilities." So that idea of opening doors and just his dad seeing sort of what the possibilities were. And yeah, it's crazy overlapping some of this again on mine. There's a thing about Jeremy in our story, but we've got we have some stuff that, geez, I'm trying to think when dad last at Jeremy's care, this would have been, 2012 or something like that. No, I'm off. 2017, 2018. But anyway, there's still stuff dad sort of invented that we're still using, we've had doctors kind of like, we've never seen something like this. It's crazy. Like, that's really clever. Yeah. So anyway, so in the story, bouncing kind of back and forth here, Paul then describes sort of what it was like to be a kid, and he has, all these harrowing adventures. And so he's not confined to the iron lung, the entirety of his life, or especially when he's younger and then into maybe middle age. I think he could be outside of it a good bit. And so with that though, and this is where the name of the book came from, 3 Minutes for a Dog, which is like, what is that? So in the book, he describes where he gets a physical therapist or a respiratory therapist that comes in, and what she needed to do is help wean him off of full dependence on the iron lung. And so he describes it this way. He said, the iron lung would be turned off and I would exercise the muscles in my throat and mouth to force air into my lungs. This breathing technique was called frog breathing and required educating muscles that had been designed by God to do other things besides force air into my lung. This therapist then made a deal with him and said that if he learned to breathe without the assistance of the iron lung for 3 minutes, he'd be rewarded with a beautiful boxer dog. And so again, 3 minutes for a dog, that becomes the title of this book. What he needed to achieve, he says, was to breathe, was to find another way to swallow air into my esophagus, like food or water except into my windpipe and lungs. And so I'm thinking, man, I mean, when we talk about like just the basics of life, like it's not even like it's automatic. Breathing is just like a function of like just being awake, right? And thinking of like he has to sort of, I mean, he has to relearn. He has to train his body, not relearn, train his body in a way to do this frog breathing technique that allows him to breathe in a way, however that is. I still don't fully understand it, but to where it's doing an action that he had lost the ability to from polio, that must contract and then exhale. I mean, this frog breathing thing. I think he then obviously, by the end of his life, he gets incredibly good, proficient at it. But that becomes his way to breathe sort of out of the tube. Um, so he goes on, and then in the book he describes, again, up into childhood, and then into young adult, and then and the book does bounce all over the place. Some people kind of knocked it hard a little bit on the editing side of like, dude, this is like flash everywhere, back, forward, and can be confusing. But so he kind of bounces all over in his life. I mean, he goes on to be in relationships. He travels. He has a friend that takes him places in his wheelchair, and then goes on to attend college, gets his bachelor's degree, graduates, goes to the U of Texas and law school. And and then he has stories everywhere, stories from his dorm in college, and he gets left at one point in the dorm. Well, he talks about like kids kids at school helping kind of take care of him, and he sort of becomes in this dorm room sort of, for some people, the freak show that they're walking by to always see. For others, he's like this guy that people really love and give him attention and help him. And then he has some crazy stories from being in college too, and that experience in a dorm. And yeah, and then he ends up going on to graduate from law school, and then become kind of fight for disability rights and things like that, and becomes an attorney, and so a practicing attorney. So it's just a wild story. And I'm trying to think what else I was going to say that I wanted to say. Yeah. So kind of then at the close, and then I think as his life as he gets older, so he lived to be 70, 78. The memoir he writes was in 2020. He passes away in 2024. So in between the memoir and then at some point, and this is another layer to how like crazy the story is that then at some point there in maybe 21, 22, 23, he gets a TikTok account, and you can still check out his videos. Polio Paul was his handle. TikTok.com at Iron Longman. And so I'll have the link to some of the stuff so you can check it out. He had almost 500,000 followers before he passed away, and he'd give regular updates on himself and have questions. And I was also thinking like the convergence of in the previous episode when we talked about art and anyway, I kind of was geeking out on like places in life where two things that you normally don't see converge together, and kind of what that opens up. And it's kind of fascinating or weird, or there's a lot of cool possibilities. But what I was thinking to have someone that has a TikTok account and also still lives in an iron lung. I mean, that's like two eras of time and technology that are like would never coexist, and coexist in the story of Paul Alexander. So just unbelievable. I just on so many levels. Yeah, I mean, just that this guy did this and wrote this story, a memoir of his life. For 8 years, it takes him painstakingly with a pen in his mouth attached to a stick, to the computer to pen this account of. And so, yeah, this is one to, when he has lines that, it's just where the context of how it's written makes each one of these, like, he fought for every breath to write every page, to write every word, to write everything he said. And he has some great lines in here. Few more things, and I'll close this thing down. He talked about when he left the hospital. Now I'm flashing back here, but he talked about when he was disconnected from the iron lung from the generator. He describes it as being plugging my life back into mom and dad's love. I thought that was cool. And then he has this also really cool kind of a line or a thought back when he was a kid at the ward fighting for his survival. And he says, there was no coherent conversation between us, but I did find myself talking to Jesus. Once I thought I heard him call my name. It was a great voice. It scared me. And I ran as fast as I could until I could not run anymore. Since that day, and he reflects back, through the years I've wondered, what did he want to say to me? So those are some words from Paul. Part of his story too is that, his life obviously depended on a lot of care and love from others that, stepped into his life and became a big part of it. So one kind of closing quote, and I love this. Someone wrote a newspaper article of detailing him earlier in his life, and I think the headline title was something like young man grits his teeth to go on to college or whatever. And I'm thinking, gritting his teeth, he's literally gritting his teeth to hold a pen in his mouth, or to have the straw or the the different things he would use his mouth for, but it literally was gritting to just hold that in his mouth. He says that, looking at his life, he said that, this is a quote, you can actually do anything, regardless of where you come from, your background, or the challenges you may face. You just have to turn your heart to it and work hard. My story is an example of why your past and even obstacles don't need to define your future. So again, it's kind of back to that line on live a great story. Man, this guy was handed the worst circumstances, I mean, imaginable, just trapped in this thing, and laying in, as a kid, describing what it was like to just lay in this thing, like wondering, am I going to get care? Is someone going to come for me? I'm itching. I can't reach that spot. I'm dying of just heat in here. I'm dying of thirst. And then for him to overcome that and to write a book and to share words that, can impact us, is huge, is amazing. Paul ended up outliving his parents, his older brother, Nick, and then even his original iron lung. I think he had, I don't know if it was a couple or had the spare. But it was in 2015. He had his was leaking air, and he did some kind of YouTube video or whatever. And God, it's still weird to say in 2015 he's doing a YouTube video to get his iron lung fixed. This is like a crazy Back to the Future episode. So he gets that fixed and helped, and then it was 2024. Then he passed away at age 78. 72 years he had lived in that thing. on and off. Closing line. He said, I spent a lot of time in the iron lung, but I didn't live in it. I lived outside it, in my mind, my heart, and the life I created. So cool. Really cool. The guy saw possibility. He saw hope where there was none. And his story is one of incredible inspiration. So hopefully something in this inspired you to think about your life differently, or your circumstances. We're all going through tough stuff at times, and life is hard. We need each other. Another good reminder in this. Paul wouldn't have made it without all the help, whether it was literally the care for his life, or just people that encouraged him along the way. So that's huge. And I'll have links in the show notes for some of the stuff if you want to dig more into the life of Paul and the iron lung. All right, great hanging out. Until next time, stay rad. Hope you enjoyed the episode today. Check out the show notes for any links or resources shared in the episode. If you enjoy the podcast, it would be really appreciated if you'd subscribe, leave a 5-star review, and share it with friends. May we all remember these words from writer Mary Oliver. Instructions for living a life. Pay attention, be astonished, tell about it.